Hello and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our roundtable on the future of equality legislation in Europe, which Equinet is co-organizing with MEP Alice Bah Kuhnke. My name is Tamás Kádár, and I'm the Deputy Director of Equinet, and I'm very happy and honored to be moderating this discussion. Just a bit of housekeeping for the beginning. As if you joined earlier, you might have seen on the slide that this is a webinar format, so only the hosts and panelists will be visible and they will be able to speak at the webinar. And you can interact, if you're an attendee, you can interact by typing your questions or remarks in the Q&A box in Zoom or in the comments section on Facebook, because we are also live streaming on Facebook. That also means that in case Zoom would stop working for you, please try following the event on Equinet's Facebook page or the events Facebook page. Just a few words about Equinet and equality bodies for those of you who might not be very familiar with us. Equinet is the European network of equality bodies. We have 49 members all across Europe, and our main objective is to help equality bodies better protect and promote equality and fight against discrimination. And we do that through capacity building and organizing different events for our members, and also for a broader audience such as this event, this roundtable. And of course, we are also collecting the experiences and expertise of our members to show that at the European level to the legislators and policymakers. Equality bodies are set up according to EU equal treatment legislation in all EU member states. It's an obligation, it's a legal obligation, and they are public bodies, which differentiates them to some extent from both civil society and from government, because they are supposed to be independent organizations promoting equality and fighting against discrimination. With today's roundtable, we have two main objectives, and this separates very neatly into two different sessions. In our first panel, we will assess where we are 12 years after the initial proposal of the Horizontal Directive, 1 year after a policy debate organized by the Finnish presidency, and at a time when we understand the German presidency of the Council is currently surveying member states concerning the nature of their concerns and objections relating to this proposed directive. So we would like to see what can we do to get this important piece of the legislative puzzle across the line. And as the Finnish presidency is concluded after the policy debate in the Council last year, because of the current gaps in the EU legislation, the protection against discrimination is not equal and complete, and this sends a questionable political message. In our second panel, our ambitions are even higher and go beyond the Horizontal Directive. We are aiming to have a discussion on how the current legislative framework could be further improved. This acknowledges that the Horizontal Directive is important, but there are other important ways the EU's equality laws could be strengthened and made better fit for today's challenges and their important purpose of achieving a union of equality for all. We have a tight schedule today and a wonderful panel full of very busy people, so I intend to be a fair but strict timekeeper. And with that, I already hand over to Tena Simonovic Einwalter, who is the chair of the Equinet Executive Board and Deputy Ombudswoman of Croatia. Tena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tamás. Welcome everyone to this event on behalf of Equinet as well as equality bodies. First, when we began planning this roundtable last year, little did we know what the world would look like and what we would have lived during the current year. We could not have imagined everything that 2020 was going to bring. And I doubt that anyone could deny that this year will be included in history books as a challenging one, but also a year that brought us all many valuable lessons and further underscored both the wide gaps in equality in our societies, as well as the vital role of the equality and non-discrimination infrastructure to combat the issues arising from these gaps. This year has been marked and profoundly shaped by two incidents in particular: the global COVID-19 pandemic and the murder of George Floyd by police in the United States that inspired millions worldwide to speak up and fight against systemic racism. Indeed, everything that has happened during this year, although unexpected, has nonetheless reinforced the relevance of advancing the equality legal framework worldwide and highlighted the need to keep equality at the top of decision makers' agendas. And we strive to rebuild our societies in the coming months and years. Equality bodies as national public institutions established to promote equality and tackle discrimination have continued to assist victims of discrimination, monitor and report on discrimination issues, and contribute to an awareness of rights and a societal valuing of equality throughout this time. The importance and urgency of our work as equality watchdogs has not ceased or decreased this year, but on the contrary, it has reinforced our belief that equality and non-discrimination are not luxury goods necessary only in good times. During the last decade, and with the approval of the 2000 directives, namely the Race Equality Directive and the Employment Equality Directive, EU equality and anti-discrimination legislation grew from the ground of gender to other grounds, ethnic and racial origin, as well as age, disability, sexual orientation, and religion and belief. At the same time, this new generation of equality legislation also revitalized and improved protection against discrimination on the ground of gender. The EU was progressively protecting more and more citizens from discrimination, harassment, and violence. However, EU anti-discrimination law does not equally protect all vulnerable groups in Europe. The draft EU Horizontal Directive, pending since July 2008, aims to offer more symmetric protection for victims of discrimination and would extend the mandate of equality bodies to also cover discrimination based on disability, sexual orientation, religion or belief, age, as well as the intersectional and multiple discrimination that results from the combination of these grounds. This would be a milestone for building a fairer and more equal Europe. If this year has taught us anything, it is that more than ever, equality matters and should be at the forefront of any policy and legislative response. Equality is a necessity and not a luxury. Strong laws are needed to ensure that all inhabitants of the EU can be protected, especially in times of crisis. We need to progress, taking into account the learnings from this year and the last decades, in constructing a strong, complete, and inclusive legislative framework to ensure that no one is left behind. National equality bodies have proven their potential during these times, working to protect victims of discrimination. In this context, Equinet and as the European Network of Equality Bodies published in June this year the recommendation for a fair and equal Europe, rebuilding our societies after COVID-19. We believe that the current crisis is an opportunity to rebuild Europe and our societies in a more fair and equal way that should include, amongst others, addressing and dismantling systemic and institutional discrimination in our societies, rigorously assessing the equality impacts of EU and national measures, reducing inequalities by targeted measures, including positive action, drastically improving the collection of equality data to inform policymaking, and adopting an intersectional approach, paying particular attention to the most vulnerable within all marginalized groups. We are here as equality bodies to ensure that no one is left behind. And today, together with our co-organizer, MEP Alice Bah Kuhnke, Vice President of the Greens in the European Parliament and Rapporteur for the Horizontal Directive, we want to build on the strong advocacy for the approval of the Horizontal Directive that Equinet has done in the past, as well as open the conversation about the future of equality legislation in Europe and what it should look like. Throughout the different panel sessions, we aim at gathering ideas, both by focusing on the Horizontal Directive proposal, whose adoption process has been stalled, as we all know, in the Council since 2008, as well as looking back in order to look forward. We want to bring the learnings of the already approved and implemented legislation, especially learnings coming from the practice of equality bodies, in order to see what is missing, what are the needs identified as next steps, and how to get there. And now, I warmly welcome you all to this roundtable. I'm confident that this will be a fruitful forum for an constructive exchange of views. Thank you.
Hvala, Tena. Thank you very much. And this is my pleasure and honor to hand over to Alice Bah Kuhnke. We are very grateful for you having accepted our invitation to co-organize this event. Alice, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for having this together with me. I'm so happy for this opportunity. Unfortunately, the phone started to ring exactly when I started to talk, but they will soon. Someone will soon answer, I hope. I first want to thank all of you that are joining us today to discuss the future of equality legislation in Europe. While it might seem obvious to most of us why legislation in the field of equal treatment and discrimination outside the labor market is so important, it has been, as we all know, almost 12 years since the EU Equal Treatment Directive was put forward by the Commission. 12 years. Despite several surveys by Eurostat and the Fundamental Rights Agency showing that discrimination is on the rise, both on different grounds, intersectionally, and in different areas of society, the deadlock of the process in the Council has been very constant. Despite the fact that surveys also have shown that the EU citizens expect a political answer to discrimination and inequality, little has happened. And despite the fact that right-wing extremists has gained strength in several member states and have even managed to enter national government offices, causing discrimination, racism, and hate to flourish. The whole situation of the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us once again that in times of crisis, inequality, injustices, and discrimination increases. On top of the fact that vulnerable groups in general are hit harder by restrictive measures and economic hardship. And as Tena said, the Black Lives Matter movement, also active in Europe, has pointed to the inequalities aimed at people of color and has pointed particularly to structural racism and violence within law enforcement. They have created a momentum for legislators and politicians as I to take action and combat racism and inequality in our society. President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, picked up on this, and we shall hold her accountable. In other words, the call for change is as relevant as ever. And turning to the topic of this event, this roundtable, what do I think that we shall aim at? What can new legislation bring to already existing legislation on combating racism, discrimination, and inequalities? We want to end the hierarchy of discrimination grounds. Discrimination hits hard, whatever the reasons behind, and everybody should be equally protected from discrimination. We want to harmonize legislation on EU level so no member state can escape treaty-founded rights and obligations. We want legislation that covers intersectionality and multiple discrimination, as none of those are addressed properly in existing legislation. And we want legislation to strengthen enforcement and reporting. Statistics is important, but enforcement and reporting to and by Commission can encourage and strengthen national efforts. We need actions at all levels. Next month, together with my colleagues in the Green Group, we will start a petition to strengthen and start up the discussions on the need for the directive. And hopefully this can create some pressure on national levels in the member states. I also intend to suggest to my colleagues in the Civil Liberties Committee in Parliament to raise the question of lifting the issue of the Equal Treatment Directive to the Justice or the General Affairs Council, I am beginning to wonder, 12 years down the road, if the Employment and Social Affairs Minister in Council are up for the job or not. I hope we all can be inspired and encouraged by each other, and I'm so looking forward to listening to all of you and to learn. Thank you.
Tack så mycket, Alice. So thank you very much both to Tena and to Alice for these brilliant introductions. Now, for the first panel, our aim with this panel is to discuss how we can get the Horizontal Directive across the line after over 10 years of stalemate in the Council. The European Commission adopted its proposal on the 2nd of July 2008. At that point, some of my colleagues were still in high school. The US President was George W. Bush, so by any measure, this is an unusually long legislative process. The Council's responsible formation and working party have been discussing it regularly, having on average at least one meeting per EU presidency dedicated to the proposal. In the process, the text has gotten more and more complex and sometimes surprisingly more distant from the cutting edge of academic thinking or even member state legislation on equality. This might well suggest that what we are observing is not legal issues with the proposal, but rather political problems created around it. And once we have the political will, sorting out the technical questions of legislation will be relatively quick and easy. And we are here to see today how this political will and momentum could be created, expecting our distinguished panelists to share one idea that could help to get the Horizontal Directive across the line and tell us about how equality bodies could assist in implementing this idea. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce our first panelist, Mr. Silvan Agius from the cabinet of Helena Dalli, Commissioner for Equality of the European Commission. Silvan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tamás, and thank you for the invitation. This is a unanimity file, which is unfortunate that equality issues require unanimity for them to be advanced, but that's a fact that needs to be stated. And indeed, because it's a unanimity file, if there is one blocking party, that means that this proposal cannot advance. We know that there are indeed political stumbling blocks. There is no secret around that. It's public knowledge. And it's precisely because of this political stumbling blocks that this proposal has not been adopted yet. So what the European Commission can do at this stage is very limited because, of course, the ball is in the Council's court. We work closely with those presidencies that want to advance the proposal forward. Case in point is the work that was done merely a year ago with the Finnish presidency. So work has been ongoing. On the part of the Commission, we do hold bilateral discussions with permanent representations here in Brussels. And so the work keeps on going. Surely, equality bodies can reach out to their respective government in two different instances, whether their government is supportive or not, regardless, because governments need to put pressure on each other, clearly. They need to say, now is the time. The same can be done by members of parliament. So it would be good if the members of parliament do this. This said, am I believing that if all this pressure is stacked up that the tables will turn? Unfortunately, I'm not sure that this is a question of pressure anymore, because that pressure was exerted on a number of occasions. So what I can say, though, is what we intend to do. We don't intend to break it into different possibilities, you know, on different grounds, for example. We do not intend to retract it. We do not intend to amend it and make it weaker or more palatable. So this proposal has indeed, as was said, been on the table for 12 years. And surely it won't be now when we have the first equality commissioner, when we're launching equality strategies, when we're putting intersectionality on the agenda systematically, when we're saying that more has to be done for equality, that we would walk out with a weaker proposal than we currently have. Thank you.
Grazie, Silvan. Thank you very much for your pessimism-infused optimism. So let's see where that can get us. Alice, I would like to hand back to you now for maybe elaborating a little bit further on your ideas that you already started sharing in the introduction.
Thank you. First of all, Mr. Agius, I'm so, every time I'm listening to you, I get filled with hope, because I can hear your how devoted you are in this fight, and I think that is very important. That is something also you can see in the commissioner you work for, that this is something that you're really fighting for, which I can feel and I can see. And I think it's so important that we work together on all levels, also in national, in the member states. And one thing that I've been thinking about when it comes to this first question is about the work in the member states and how the national bodies, the national equality bodies are working, because I can see that there are some differences when you look in the member states. And one factor of success in the Swedish case, when I was the Minister of Democracy in the Swedish government, I worked a lot with the Swedish discrimination laws, and also a lot with our DO, Diskrimineringsombudsmannen, as it's called. And they were successful in communications, because since the majority of people in the member states are not discriminated on an everyday basis, they really had to put a lot of effort in communicating about the laws, but also about what discrimination is and how it's put forward and how it feels, and all the wrongdoings you do as an employer or a school and so on and so forth, or if you own a restaurant, a bar or a club or whatever. And I think this communication part is something that, of course, everybody takes for granted. Of course, you need to communicate, even if you are an agency, or if you are, like in this case, an equality body. But I think that you need also to be brave enough to have a focus on communication, and really, because since we also are backlashing in so many different ways, and in so many different parts of when we talk about discrimination, I think that's extra important. Communicate, communicate, communicate. What is the law saying, and what is discrimination, and why is it so important that we fight discrimination? So that in combination with really being a nail in the butt, you say in Swedish, on the governments, I think it's two key factors for success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice, also for teaching us about the Swedish language a little bit. Now it's my pleasure to hand over to our next panelist, Robert Biedron, from the group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats from Poland. Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tamás, and I'm really honored to be with Equinet today, and thank you for having me and being with these wonderful panelists. And I must also say that I really appreciate work of Helena Dalli as Equality Commissioner, and Silvan himself, and we know that we are in good hands, and you know that European Parliament is on your side, and we always will. But I will talk from the perspective of a troublemaker.
Okay, as usual with these events, I think we are experiencing, or Robert is experiencing, a little bit of technical difficulties. So while hopefully he's reestablishing connection, I would like to move on to MEP Malin Björk. Malin, thank you very much for joining us. Malin is from the group of the European United Left and Nordic Green Left, also from Sweden.
Yes, hello. Hello. Very nice to be among you. I hope we will get our colleague Biedron back on screen soon. I think, you know, I can only agree to what has been said so far in terms of the challenges we are facing. I think the Parliament has been very clear, and certainly my group, the Left Group, has been very clear that we expect action from the Commission and from the Member States, and the Commission must be the problem solver also in terms of the ones that can put forward text. We have both the last legislature and this legislature, when I have been a member of Parliament, taken several initiatives for pressure, but also concretely to try to put energy into this process. I must also say, just as a general, and we will maybe come back to that in the second panel, where I will still be with you about, you know, anti-discrimination legislation is one part of the puzzle, but the inequalities and injustices that Alice and others have raised are also playing on so many different levels when it comes to climate justice, when it comes to COVID recovery, and as actors for equality and anti-discrimination, we have to have our eyes open on all these different instruments, and it is indeed a challenge. So our anti-discrimination work is happening on very, very many files and on different levels. I think it's also the mobilization and the work we have seen now on against anti-Black racism, which, you know, last legislature we had the first ever People of African Descent week in the European Parliament, which hosted me together with the Intergroup Against Racism and Discrimination, and now that work carrying forward, and of course all the mobilizations that followed the assassination of George Floyd, shows that here in Europe, despite then, you know, in terms of legislative provisions at EU level, the legislation against what's called, in Sweden is maybe a bit of a strange word, but racial discrimination is stronger. It's the strongest package of legislation compared to gender equality, or indeed the other forms in the Horizontal Directive, which is the weakest. But still with that, we don't have the tools for equality and to face the structural discrimination. And I know that Alice, myself, the Left Group, the Greens, the S&D Group, we are working on structural inequalities on many different levels. When it comes to the directive, I think we have to make progress. And I would welcome also the kind of work on national level, but also to look into what ministers need to be at the table for things to move on. You know, it's too easy to say that part, let's park that somewhere where things are not moving forward sufficiently. We want Dali to be at the center of this process, but she should have the relevant ministers facing her in bringing this issue forward. I think that's one opening. And of course, we in the Parliament, as a progressive alliance of people that want to work on this directive, we are ready to work with the rapporteur, but also with the Commission to make this happen.
Thank you very much, Malin, for your reminder of the bigger context, as well as calling also attention to the national level work. Robert, we lost you at some point. You, of course, underlined the important role Helena Dalli is playing. Please, the floor is now back to you.
Thank you, Tamás, and I'm sorry I got lost, but I'm back. So I'll be very brief, not to take your time. I think what we should do is not to wait for EU legislator. It's the EU institutions, European Parliament and others' role to push on that, but we have our work to do also on national level, and I think we should act there. And there are many individual and social level activities we can push forward. There are courageous people who are taking their own cases to the courts, and on precedent-setting cases we can influence the changes, and we can use the tool of promotion mentioned and communication mentioned by Alice to promote that there are examples of discrimination by the case law, by the precedents, and to show that there is a real need of horizontal directive, that without good harmonization of legislation, without the equal legislation on discrimination in every single country, we will not reach the level of equality we are fighting for. So Poland is a good example in this matter. We have, for example, Polish Society for Anti-Discrimination, which conducts this kind of precedent-setting cases, and they try to push the agenda forward in the context of anti-discrimination. And there are many cases all around member states, and I think one of the ideas would be exchange and promotion of good practices in this level. So we could encourage also throughout the ombudsman, equality bodies, we could encourage people to inform about their cases and go to the courts and fight for the rights. And I think the Polish ombudsman, which is in very difficult political environment in today's Poland, you must remember he's been attacked under threat. He is very courageous to search for people being discriminated, and he is actively helping them to take cases and to fight for the rights and fight for in the courts. And I think this would be one of the activities we could use in this period when we don't have good horizontal legislation in this matter. So, and then Alice would have a great tool together with us to communicate good cases too, which is very important to sensitize people how important it is to have this legislation, because I'm afraid many people don't have this this conscious.
Thank you very much, Robert. Dziękuję bardzo. It's great to have your input on the importance of equality bodies, of course, since I'm speaking here for Equinet, and indeed we can bring stories which are extremely important in the communication that was also mentioned by Alice. Now, I would like to give the floor to MEP Maria Walsh from the group of the European People's Party from Ireland, who is also a shadow rapporteur on the file. Maria, we understand you're extremely busy, so we are absolutely thrilled and very happy to have you and appreciate your effort.
No, I'm delighted to be here. And first and foremost, let me just say, you know, there's things that us MEPs, and no doubt my colleagues, are like, these are the events that we want to give as much time, listen, interact, and then all the other SHIT that seems to appear in the last minute just seems to always take over. So I hope all, and I see participants numbers are increasing as we're engaging more and more. So I'm just sorry I have to peace out a little bit earlier. But long story short, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you very, very much for welcoming me here. As shadow rapporteur for this very important report on the Discrimination Directive, I'm delighted to be a part of today's discussion, which has shared some concrete and ideas-based options than, I must say, even in these few words from colleagues, than any other event of its nature. So as we say in Ireland, congratulations, cogorticus to date. We can all recognise that huge gaps exist in national anti-discrimination laws, which continue to exist without an overarching EU framework. And the Council's decision to stick a delay on this issue for the last 12 years is not only disappointing, but for more how I'm to capture really how I'm feeling, I think it's disgusting at this point to speak really directly that this hasn't moved on in this period of time. I recently had the opportunity to discuss this issue with the German Minister for EU Affairs, a part of the LGBTQI intergroup, and I see my fellow colleague on that, Malin, has just spoken. And I asked him whether he felt progress for this directive would be made in their trio of council presidency. So we're looking at Germany, Portugal, and Slovenia. He could not guarantee that the German presidency would gain valiant efforts on this issue, which again is disappointing. And left me leaving a little bit frustrating and scratching my head as to, well, how do we get further on here? You didn't ask, I think, any of us, but I can speak on behalf of myself. You didn't ask me a very an easy question at the outset of this event: is what do I think can happen to move us closer? Which makes me question why anybody gave me the MEP title in the first place. But my idea for getting this file across the line really comes in form of two things: coordination and forward thinking. We thankfully have a commissioner for equality this mandate, thankfully. Now, we might not sit on the same political party, but we sure and hell do have the same views when it comes to a more cohesive and equality-driven society. She's committed to publishing several strategies and has other plans on issuing furthermore involving discrimination. A couple of ones for participants watching is the gender equality strategy that we are due to see later this year, the EU anti-racism action plan published in September. I know many colleagues have already mentioned the renowned and the renewed EU Roma framework launched this month, and of course the LGBTI equality strategy expected by the end of this year. So a lot of great work happening within the discrimination space. These are all important provisions to address structural discrimination and provide goals for the EU institutions to work towards collectively in our policy making. However, we need to ensure what is being put forward can be effective, and not just on an EU level, not just events like this where we're all agreeing, but on national level, which need to be, it needs to go hand in hand to fully protect our citizens that are living in our communities, both in the urban areas as much as the rural areas.
Excuse me, Maria,
I will have to ask you to start wrapping up.
Perfect. Oh my God, this is wonderful. This is wonderful. Your timekeeping, this is what happens when I ad lib, sorry. The publications needed to actively work towards an overarching directive, as we know. It doesn't result in some form of EU legislation, then we are missing the key objective. And I just want to stress this point. If we have no real weight, ultimately we are affording no real protection to our citizens. A very basic suggestion that all events, all work that we do in relation to these initiatives mentioned, collective we must reiterate that we need the anti-discrimination directive to be supported at council level. And that needs to be our end goal. So events like this, every time we speak in the plenary, every time we speak in our group, collectively, the we across the broad church of our political institution needs to roll in behind. I want to applaud, of course, the Commission and your work here. And I will finish up by saying that I hate to finish my words with an apology as I started. I have a team member called Emer Deary on the call who's been following this very closely, and she will continue listening and report back to me. Any work that and any support that my office can do, please just give me a shout. And I just want to appreciate the opportunity to even just have this conversation and learn from each other. And finally, to thank Joni, and I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, who just was really flexible and welcoming and Cogorgicus again, and delighted to see colleagues from across our floor driving the one message that this needs to move out from the council, and we actually need to start doing our jobs now collectively, we protecting our citizens at the very core of the European Union. Thank you very much.
Maria, Mile Bujkas, thanks a million. It's really great to hear about your frustration. I think it's good to be a little bit angry about having to wait for 12 years. And it's also good to hear your ideas about coordination, cross-party lines, really, for everyone who thinks it's important to have equality legislation. So thank you very much again for joining us and sharing your thoughts. Now I would like to hand over to our Equality Body participants, starting with Ms. Sandra Konstatsky, the Director of the Ombud for Equal Treatment in Austria. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Okay, I hope my video will get started now.
We can already hear you, so you can please start.
That's great. So having so little time. Yeah, hello, good afternoon, and thanks a lot for this great invitation to this important event. My idea, perhaps, because I was asked for an idea of an equality body, seemed a bit opposite to what Mr. Agius said, but I think it's not. And I think I can follow up to what has been said about communicating equality and telling the stories. Austria is unfortunately one of the few member states that did not go beyond equal treatment law, European equal treatment law. Regarding the grounds of discrimination, except for disability. So since more than 10 years, the Austrian Ombudsman for Equal Treatment is trying to get the full Equal Treatment Act, trying to get it completely, so that there will be a full protection for all people who suffer from discrimination in access to goods and services. And there is even a lack against sex discrimination, because the Equal Treatment Act does not give the same protection as for ethnic origin. We have not succeeded yet to get the so-called full leveling up of our Equal Treatment Act. But there is always a point that Austria the Austrian Ombudsman doesn't want to wait for European legislation. No, the Austrians always want to wait for European legislation, the Austrian government, but the Austrian Ombudsman does not want. So of course, for the first, we would strongly need the Horizontal Directive, but as an equality body, we try to find new ideas for getting things done in Austria. Okay, perhaps now my video starten, yeah? Okay, hi. We have just submitted our biannual report to Parliament, and our strongest demand is still to get full legislation. And what we try now is to point out the separate grounds and tell the stories of the people who suffer from lack of protection. So we are now more focused on, not on the whole legislation to get leveling up, but to talk about single grounds, and our regional offices really help a lot to get the cases, because they are more related to the people's day-to-day experiences, especially during the Corona crisis. So we now try to talk about, with the Parliament, we try to talk about not leveling up, but the old woman who suffers from discrimination regarding to health services, and the girl that feels discriminated because of a school lockdown. So one idea from the Austrian equality body, perhaps not talk about the Horizontal Directive, focus more on the particular grounds. I heard that there is not a plan to present single ground legislation drafts, but I think the Austrian equality body, not the Austrian, the equality bodies will have the stories to focus on the ground. And I would say the strengthening of the equality bodies and their standards will be a crucial point for coming forward. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for your thoughts and for all the action that you are doing at the national level in Austria. Now, my pleasure is to ask our last panelist for this panel, Mr. Bernhard Franke, the acting head of the Federal Anti-Discrimination Agency in Germany.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. To be frank, I don't know if there is any one idea that could just do the trick. I think we have to be clear-eyed in our assessment that under current political circumstances, the German government simply does not believe that there should be an additional equal treatment directive. The resistance is deep-seated inter alia because of the difficulties in transposing the earlier equality directives into German law in 2006. This makes it very hard to argue against it, as subsequent European Commission, Parliaments, Council presidencies, and we ourselves had to find out. We very much regret the government's position on this issue because we believe it is crucial to achieve a common standard for protection against discrimination across the European Union. We have therefore continuously tried to convince the government to change its view, but sadly without success. So what can be done? I think two things are now important. The German presidency is, of course, keenly aware of its responsibility for European fundamental rights and fundamental values. So in this presidency, everybody in Brussels and across the European Union should make it clear how that relates to the Horizontal Directive and why this directive is needed. And the other thing, next year, Germany will hold national elections, followed by coalition negotiations, which end up in a coalition treaty. For better or worse, coalition treaties are somewhat sacred documents in German politics. What is in them has a chance of getting done. What is not in them can be blocked by one of the partners. These next negotiations might offer the most crucial opportunity for a breakthrough in coming years. I promise that we will do our very best to convince the coalition partners that Germany must lift its objections. However, we must also think about the options that we have if all this fails. Do we really want to meet again to mark the proposal's 15th or 20th anniversary? Or are there other additional ways to achieve the important goals of the Horizontal Directive? We might have to become creative about alternative but not weaker plans to advance equality for all in Europe. This is why I'm very excited about the second panel as well, because I believe it is important to bring a new dynamic into the European policy debate on this matter. Thank you very much.
Dankeschön, Herr Franke. Thank you very much for your thoughts, very practical and concrete thoughts regarding the German coalition building and coalition agreement, and also calling attention to the fact that after 12 years, we need to think of different pathways to get this across the line. Now, thank you very much to all our panelists for their useful thoughts on the Horizontal Directive. Now, let's start another session full of brainstorming, ambitious thinking, and dreaming big. The Horizontal Directive is a key piece of the puzzle, but it is far from the only thing missing from it when it comes to equality legislation in Europe. In June this year, Equinet published its recommendations for a fair and equal Europe and rebuilding our societies after COVID-19, as Tena has already mentioned. These recommendations show a number of ways in which equality legislation could and should be strengthened if we are to achieve a union of equality for all. For example, and I will just name a few examples or bring up a few examples to start the debate. Even with the Horizontal Directive in place, the Equal Treatment Directives would cover a much more limited field than the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU and many national laws, leaving out, for example, discrimination in policing and other state functions, and not covering grounds such as socioeconomic disadvantage and health status, which have proven to give rise to many discriminatory actions and situations during the pandemic, but even before that. The effectiveness and secondly, the effectiveness and dissuasiveness of sanctions applied in discrimination cases clearly need strengthening. The third point is that this kind of strengthening is also, of course, necessary for national equality bodies in order to enable them to fulfill their potential. And the guarantees put forward by the European Commission in its recommendation on standards for equality bodies 2 years ago have to be further detailed and fully implemented. And for that, we very likely would need them to be legally binding. We will also need to find ways to address systemic discrimination and inequalities, have some better ideas for assessing all the policies for their impact on equality, both at the development and at the evaluation stage. We need to think about, or could think about, positive action measures and using them to a better effect. We can think about statutory equality duties, which already exist in some countries, and how to use them, as they seem to be very useful in those countries. And of course, also the collection of equality data in a disaggregated way to inform us about where the problems lie and where action is needed would also be very important. The commitments expressed by the Commission in their action plan against racism published last month to consider addressing the shortcomings identified in the current legislation can give us hope that all this might be possible and provide a perfect foundation for our discussions in this panel. Now, all panelists will have 4 minutes to identify shortcomings and areas for improvement in the current EU equality legislation, and to discuss concrete proposals for improving EU equality legislation and how these will lead to a more equal Europe. Now, it is my pleasure to hand over the floor again. We are starting with Mr. Silvan Agius from the Cabinet of Commissioner Helena Dalli. Silvan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I appreciate the words from the parliamentarians, but also from Equinet members, of course, regarding our team and the Commissioner being there and really wanting to advance the equality agenda systematically. That is indeed why we are here. That is the union of equality that we are pushing. And of course, we can't push it by ourselves. You are key partners in this push. Hearing the discussion that we are having, I remembered of Belinda Pike, who was the director on equality matters in justice when the Equal Treatment Directive proposal was made. And in her mind, she had a clear vision of Europe where all equality legislation would come together in one easy to understand directive called the Equality Directive simply, where all the grounds would have the same level of protection, and that would have been by 2015. In 2008, that was a vision that one could have, and it kind of made sense. Today, we're still discussing the 2008 proposal, and unfortunately, as you rightly point out, Tamás, we're far away from filling the gaps in equality legislation that we have. Of course, the political circumstances we find ourselves in are such where we have not been able to advance fairly fundamental pieces of legislation like the Horizontal Treatment Directive. This said, we're not being dissuaded by that environment from making concrete proposals. And the strategies launched until now, I believe, show the direction that the Commission is taking, that we really mean business on equality, and we will not shy away from putting proposals forward. This year, we celebrated 20 years of Equinet. No, not of Equinet, of equality bodies. Equinet a bit shorter than that, but nonetheless, equality bodies have been part of EU law since 20 years. And despite this, in some instances, equality bodies are still not the powerful institutions that can bring equality at the national level, simply because the standards applied at the domestic level are not strong enough, right? So there could be various things done in that regard to strengthen equality bodies further. So one proposal could indeed be that of strengthening equality bodies through a new legislative proposal, which is in line with the political guidelines of the President. She already made it clear that there would be new anti-discrimination legislation at the beginning of this mandate. We have clearly indicated that in the anti-racism action plan, and so that could be one way forward. This is something that, of course, we would be reaching out to Parliament and to Equinet for input in the process. Intersectionality is crucial to our work. Like equality mainstreaming, intersectionality is another method that cannot be employed sometimes and not on other instances. So I agree with MEP Bah Kuhnke that we need to make this an integral part of the way we work, and also of legislative measures. So we will be looking into that as well. In the anti-racism action plan, the matter of policing and its possible inclusion in anti-discrimination legislation was already referred to. And again, this is something that we will be looking at, as well as we need to have proper anti-hatred legislation for all the grounds in the EU. The current treaty doesn't allow for proposals like the framework decision to be there for other grounds beyond race and ethnic origin, but we'll be working on that to expand the scope of the treaty, hopefully, and be able to put forward legislation. So, referring back to the views that the Commission may have had in 2008, unfortunately, clearly, as the reality showed us, that wasn't doable, wasn't workable. But we are not giving up, and we hope that we can achieve the change that parliamentarians and you wish for. Thank you.
Patsy, thank you very much, Silvan. It's great to hear the commitment from the Commission's side and the ideas. Of course, we are especially pleased to hear you talking about potential strengthening of equality bodies by way of legislation at the EU level. We think it's very important, and also all the other things you mentioned from intersectionality to others. Now it is my pleasure to hand over to Mr. Patrick Charlier, who is co-director of UNIA, the Interfederal Center for Equal Opportunities in Belgium. Patrick, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Tamás. I would like to address two questions in this panel, one on the standard for equality body and the second one on the anti-racism action plan, and to show how can European initiative support the national level and actors. First of all, I want to stress the added value and the importance of the standard for equality body, which has been adopted by the Commission. Els Keisman and I are leading UNIA as college, and we are appointed by a management board. This board is composed by 21 people who are themselves appointed by 6 parliaments in Belgium, federal, region, and community. The members of the board have to be renewed after their 6 years mandate. Even if it's not legally compulsory by the law, we ask the 6 parliaments to open the procedure of the nomination for the board to everybody. We argued that the EU standards, but also the principles of Paris and the general recommendation number 2 of the ECRI, strongly recommend to have such a procedure to guarantee the independence, the pluralism, and the representativity of the board, civil society, social partners, academics, and so forth. 5 of the 6 parliaments accepted to open the procedure and made an appeal in the Moniteur Belge, which is the official gazette, sometimes also preparing some hearings from the candidates before appointing. I'm pretty sure that it's thanks to the standards and the other recommendation that we convinced those 5 parliaments to do so. There is one exception. The Flemish Parliament, until now, didn't accept to open the procedure. They want to choose and nominate the 4 Flemish members between them. As such, it could be problematic. But especially since, according to the results of the last election, the Vlaams Belang, a far-right party, which has been convicted of racism in 2004 after we proceed against him, this party wants to choose one of the 4 Flemish members of our board. They are the second party in Flanders. Even if it should be only 1 member on 21, it's for us unthinkable to have somebody coming from such a party in our board. Again, based on the EU standards, the principle of Paris and the LGP2 ECRI, we made a strongly lobby to the other Flemish parties to explain that such a nomination is a red line and could strongly affect our institution, but also hurt the reputation of Flanders, in particular at the international level. This Monday, the proposal has been raised that the Parliament should not nominate anybody, letting the current members to follow their mandate until Flanders should create its own equality body. It's probably not the most elegant solution, but it's the way that the political party have found to avoid a far-right member in our board. I am sure that it's thanks to the standards, principle and recommendation that we have now avoided this peril. In that sense, confirming and reinforcing the standards seems to me crucial, and why not then make legally binding for the EU member state, as Tamás said, just to avoid such a situation. I will be shorter for my second point.
You have around half a minute for the second point.
Okay, it will be short. Since 2001, we are advocating for a national action plan against racism. After 20 years, now we have a strong commitment from different governments for such an interfederal action plan, hoping that it could be adopted in 2021. I hope that the anti-racism action plan adopted by the EU will inspire and push to Belgian authorities to jump from words to acts. Fighting racism is still nowadays a challenge and a duty. Thank you.
Merci, Patrick. Dank u wel. Dankeschön. It's great to hear about the practical application and use of the already existing standards for equality bodies, and I think this just testifies to the importance of having even stronger standards. And thank you also for teaching us in the process also about the simple constitutional build-up of Belgium as a country. Next, I would like to move on to Alice again. Back to you for your thoughts on the broader and longer time future of equality legislation.
Thank you. And first of all, there are so many interesting points of views and suggestions coming up that you really want to, just jump in there and be part of and comment on what already have been said. But I know that due to the plan that we have for this roundtable, it's now time to identify shortcomings and discuss concrete proposals. So one thing that has been mentioned, but that I really want to underline, is the lack of the same standards in the different member states. In the time that we live in, it's you can't defend that. You can't defend that we are one union and we have so many different standards. I think it's unworthy, the European Union, that we haven't come past this. Why don't we have the same when it comes to these basic principles on how you build your life and what protection you have? I think it's really a shame. So this is something that is one big shortcoming, the different standards in the equality legislation in different member states. And I also think what was mentioned when we started this roundtable, that the different instructions to the national equality bodies is also an obstacle. I think it's a shortcoming. We would have been much stronger as a union fighting discrimination if it was more, if it was the same, shortly said. I also think that the intersectional perspective that has been raised from several earlier speakers, Malin raised it, all of you have pointed on intersectionality and the importance of making intersectionality not only a buzzword, but also a concrete tool to fight discrimination. The discrimination within the discrimination is so important, and we all know who are the victims and how the intersectionality plays such important role when it comes to fighting discrimination, to have that perspective also within the legislation, but also among within the jurisdiction, among those people who sits, the lawyers and the people who really is the one who should judge. They also need to have this knowledge, and this is something when it comes to education. From the Swedish perspective, we have now seen figures on how we have been in lack of when it comes to other part of where the law is important, when it comes to the way that our judges, what they know about, for example, discrimination and racism, not at least in an intersectional perspective, that it also plays a part when they do their work. So this is crucial. Knowledge spread among different parts in our society. So in short, this was this. I know that we are in the lack of don't have so much time, so I stop there. Thank you.
Tack så mycket, Alice. It's great to have your thoughts, and of course I think it's a very strong message. This is the second time I hear some very negative words. Also, Maria Walsh talked about being disgusting and being disgusted and disappointed. You talked about all of us having to be ashamed of not having the same standards. I think the use of such words really drives home how important it would be to move forward and have stronger standards at the European level. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Sophie Latraverse, who is the Director of Legal Expertise to the General Secretariat of the Defender of Rights in France. Sophie, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I will be speaking from the standpoint of enforcement, which is beside the aesthetics of the legislation itself, its efficiency and its capacity to have an impact is closely related to some enforcement aspect on which we have, as we are very much engaged on this issue of enforcement, been tackling with since the beginning of the existence of our equality body, which is very devoted to bringing about true efficiency of equality law before the courts. And there are two aspects on which I would like to make a contribution, which is maybe a bit technical, but still I think it's essential. In continental Europe, there is a particular difficulty relating to access to evidence and the way the directives have been framed on the Anglo-Saxon model. And to this day, judges in all of the European countries have a difficulty accepting to give access to evidence to plaintiffs. In France, where there's been a true battle on this issue and it has tremendously improved, still, if you consider that there are hundreds of first instance courts, very much so, you have 80% chance to not have access to evidence in first instance. And this is still a big issue, and it ponders on the efficiency of the law and whether it is a true threat to those who discriminate, particularly in employment. And therefore, I would maybe frame it, this is how I thought about it, I would frame it maybe adding provision on the duty of a judge to facilitate access to enforcement is a real issue. I think it would talk to judges because we must not forget that this law is getting informed in various legal cultures, which have various point of views on what is the duty of the judge with respect to what occurs before him and evidence. And in equal treatment legislation, access to the evidence of unequal treatment is essential. And at this point, we are still, after 15 years of existence and working very much on this, on putting forward a strategy of doing litigation only on access to evidence. So we are still really tackling this matter. And I think on issues of shortcomings, this is a real aspect. Secondly, on the issue of sanctions, which Tamás alluded to earlier, today, even in France, where there is no ceiling on damages, it is very economically rentable for organization to continue to discriminate because very few people are going to litigate. And if we want on systemic aspect, issues that are global, to have an incentive to go forward and invest in equality, because if for economic operators, it's really an investment in equality, we have to think improving sanctions and group actions, and even going, and I know this is a taboo word, but to punitive damages. I think that even more on the Horizontal Directive that deals with access to goods and services, compensatory damages do not go very far. And if we want to have a true use of the law as a means of pressure on enforcement and implementation of new standards, I think that we have to incorporate an approach to punitive damages when there is reiteration, where there is no collaboration with equality bodies, when there is no enforcement of recommendation. There is a true aspect of creating economic incentive on implementing equality law. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Sophie. I think it's really useful to have this engagement and to have you here, MEPs, also engage with equality bodies that can also bring some very, very practical thoughts and experiences from the national level. And I think you calling attention to how after 20 years, the equality legislation seems still very far away from the everyday reality of judges in continental Europe, and the whole logic of it doesn't seem to be grasped by them. And yes, I think I would really love to also discuss much longer the question of sanctions. I think these are also crucial. We need to have effective implementation of the existing legislation before we can move forward. But we have to move forward with the program. So I'll now pass on the floor again to Malin to share her thoughts on the future of legislation.
Hello again, everyone. Well, certainly, I think we have spoken about the shortcomings. I think we have a fairly grim picture of those, to be honest. I will mention a few things that I thought of and that I think that we could pick up on our agenda. Some of them are legislative, some others not. I'm working very much within the LIBE Committee in the European Parliament, but also with the Progressive Alliance in the European Parliament on rule of law, democracy and fundamental rights issues. The European, the Council, the member states have decided that they are going to have some kind of conditionality mechanism on this. However, they don't want to include, I would say, equality generating factors such as fundamental rights, the rights of civil society to strong civil society, and freedom for fundamental rights as defined in the Charter in in their conditionality clauses. So that is a battle we have to have, and the Parliament is very clear that we want to see this scope enlarged, and this is linked to a specific piece of legislation, the regulation for protecting the financial interests of the Union, which would demand, rule of law and principles to be respected. I think this is an equality issue also. We cannot operate in an environment that doesn't respect the rule of law and democratic principles. We cannot generate policies that generate equality if all this is undermined. And that I will join what was said by our Belgian colleague. Hungary and Poland and others, they want to even try to use our bodies, in terms of and reshape the way we think about democracy to the liberal democracy. And what if they take ownership of the inequality body? What will be their new ideology of equality, as they have a new ideology that they want to impose when it comes to democracy, liberal democracy. So we have to be very vigilant about that. And now we have this possibility of a regulation that has to be agreed and be put in place. The other thing, very quickly, is public procurement. I know it's not our home turf, but we have a situation where from the beginning was all about competition rules. Then environmental concerns have to be inserted there, and also labor rights concerns, and that's so that member states can have a much more progressive legislation when it comes to public procurement. It's a lot of money, and you could add to that respect for equality, so that you could privilege companies that have an ambitious equality policy against hate crimes, and I think the Commission mentioned that. I think that's important, and also to strengthen equality bodies, but then to take the lessons learned from Belgium and insert in that legislative work, then insert provisions that make sure that we safeguard equality bodies also in terms of their mandate and their compositions, to make sure that they actually serve, future that where we have to have protection against authoritarian states inside the European Union. So that's very short. I hope we can discuss this more, because I think we will need more instruments than the ones that we have thought about 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So that is certainly very useful. I see that you are also working with strategic litigation for the first time in the Equinet, and that's certainly one way. But then we have to work with the European Court of Human Rights, which is a different body. So if I stay to the EU legislation, then I'll stop here. Thank you.
Tack så mycket, Malin. It's very important. I think you made some very important points linking the rule of law and equality, which we also did in Equinet. We submitted a contribution to the rule of law report of the EU, which of course has the strength that it has as regards countries that are already undermining that rule of law, one could say. But I think it's a very important point to underline that unequal outcomes are also just intrinsically linked with the lack of rule of law. And now, to continue on our string of Swedish speakers, it is my pleasure to hand over to Mr. Martin Mörk, who is the Deputy Ombudsman and Head of Litigation of the Diskrimineringsombudsmannen in Sweden. So, varsågod, Martin.
Tack Tamás. Hej Alice och ni andra. Sorry to have a Swedish address. I had the pleasure and privilege to have Alice as a minister in charge of our authority. So I've had the pleasure to meet her in other circumstances. I'm not going to take the time more. I'm going to make 3 proposals. And they all pertain to effective enforcement, I would say, of the existing legislation, which is, of course, as Tamás mentioned, critical for the future as well. The first proposal is actually a proposal of a mental shift. Because when we talk about effective enforcement of discrimination law, we tend to focus on one aspect, and it's the aspect of, do victims have right to reparation, and what are their access to justice? We tend to forget that the primary right secured by the directives is the right not to be discriminated against. And I think that if we focus on that right more, then we will also focus on preventing victims from being victims in the first place. And if you ask victims, that's what they want. So, and that requires a little bit of a shift, mental shift, that we focus less perhaps on victims and more on perpetrators, to ensure that perpetrators are not perpetrators. And in order to do so, it's the second proposal, because we already have an existing legal framework that provides that there should be effective and deterrent sanctions. But we know, mainly also because of Equinet's work and research, that when it comes to this aspect, there are possibilities of reparations that are of course not being used. But when it comes to actually effective sanctions, our national systems are defunct. one reason is this Ferein case that's been interpreted as there's no requirement of having economic fine. It's a complete misinterpretation of the ruling. It just says that for some infringements, you don't need a fine. But if we're looking to the kinds of infringement that we see today, specifically in the digital world, such as algorithmic discrimination, it's clear that we do need massive fines, massive sanctions in order to get things to happen. I think this is what Sophie Latraverse is also saying. For example, you have algorithms that are sorting based on postcodes. If you are living in a certain postcode where it's predominantly non-white persons of color living, and you get your credit denied just because of living that postcode, there is no sanctions for that, unless there's someone who finds out that they were discriminated because of the postcode and maybe makes a report. But this stuff goes on and it's affecting thousands of people. And I think we need to look into what sanctions are there under the directive. And the directive says discrimination should not take place. It does not only say that victims should have redress. So I think this is my second proposal, is that the Commission actually looks into the implementation of the sanction provision, and specifically when it comes to this type of infringement that is affecting thousands of persons. My third point is linked to that, because what I'm actually talking is that the private enforcement model that we have in most of our countries is not working. The costs are too high for litigation, the risks are too high, we have judges that don't understand, etc., etc., and it hasn't been working for the past 35 years. So there's no chances that it will work. You can tweak it, you can fix certain things, but that's not. If you want effective enforcement, that's not where we should look. We should look at public enforcement. And in order to have sanctions, if you have those kinds of sanctions, you need someone to put those sanctions in place. And you also need someone that can investigate whether there has been an infringement. And you already have an existing structure under the directive, and it's the equality bodies. They're already set up. So I think what one needs to do is to empower the equality bodies so that they can investigate. It's not maybe necessary that they should have the sanctioning powers, but they should at least be able to apply for sanctions when they determine these kinds of infringements. And that would be my third proposal. Thank you.
Tack så mycket, Martin. I think we have to clarify that I don't suppose Martin and Sophie Latraverse had a discussion beforehand, but I think that their interventions really connect very well, and they underline the importance of proper enforcement of the existing legislation. And of course, very powerful points, I think, that both Martin and Sophie made when it comes to sanctions and the basic model of reparation instead of prevention, and the lack of investigative powers or investigative opportunities. And I think that if we put that in the context of another human right that everyone knows, I think that drives home the point very powerfully, because if you open up the GDPR, which everyone knows, if you check the provisions on sanction, you might get some surprises. I'll leave you to that surprise to find it out yourself. But here now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to our last panelist in this panel, MEP Radka Maxová from the Renew Europe group from Czechia. Radka, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Tamás. Dear all, I am grateful to Equinet and MEP Kuhnke for the organization of this virtual event. It's great to see that we are all united in our work and ambitions for a more equal Europe. In regards to the space for improvement, I would like to mention the disability focal points, which are part of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The convention is the first binding international human rights instrument to specifically address disability. Article 33 contains provisions for implementation and monitoring of the treaty in the form of three-pillar structure. Firstly, it requires the states to designate focal points for matters relating to the implementation of the convention. Secondly, it recommends the state to consider establishment or designation of a coordination mechanism. And finally, it requires the states to designate a framework for monitoring the implementation of the convention. Already in 2015, the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, in its concluding observation, recommended appointing disability focal points in all Commission DGs and agencies and in all EU institutions, including the Council and Parliament, together with establishing an interinstitutional coordination mechanism. The recommendation is also part of several motions for resolution, and the establishment of disability focal points has also been recommended by the European Economic and Social Committee, as well as various non-governmental organizations. Despite this, the disability focal points were not yet established, with the only exception of the UNCRPD focal point of the European Commission, the Disability Unit of Directorate General Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. In conclusion, the focal points would, at the political level, ensure disability mainstreaming in all policies, as well as they would, at the administrative level, ensure disability mainstreaming in the EU institution as public administration. As such, the establishment of such disability focal points is essential for the effective and compliant implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is a basic prerequisite for ensuring rights of the person of disabilities as full citizens. I firmly believe that the disability focal points are a strategic opportunity for the EU to improve its equality legislation, thereby creating a more equal Europe. Thank you for your attention.
MEP Maxová, děkuji. Thank you very much. It's very good to hear also about how different models and different legislation at the international level can help and work in a synergetic way to help us reach better equality outcomes. And I think that the UN CRPD and the associated mechanisms in it are really powerful example that can be used. So thank you very much to all our panelists in this second panel. Now we are coming to the final straight of our event and roundtable. And now I would like to ask all our panelists for any closing comments that they would like to make. I'm going to start with Sandra Konstacki to ask if she has some comments that she would quickly like to make.
Thank you. Well, I have just a very common comment about the crisis in Europe, because we have already seen huge crises. We've seen the banking crisis in 2008 and the refugee crisis in 2015. And now I think all the time they told us that the equality issue is always evaluated as something luxury, something, well, we don't need it now. And now in the current crisis, and also before, we are now facing that things really got worse and we need it. And I think now the challenge is to get strong equality bodies and to see that we are the ones that not only are the watchdogs, but also to tell the stories behind the equal treatment legislation behind it, and the lack of it, where there is a lack of legislation. And I think we should be inspired and we should rebuild an Europe, as also Tena said before, an Europe of fair and equal, rebuild it in a fair and equal way.
Thank you very much, Sandra. I'll give now the floor to Mr. Bernhard Franke from FADA to give his closing thoughts.
Thank you very much. First of all, it is very uplifting to hear so many concrete and important proposals. And recent signals from the Commission have also been very good ones. Starting with the recommendations on the standards for equality bodies, followed by the creation of a portfolio for equality, and now the commitments in its action plan against racism, as well as in the Roma strategy. I found it very encouraging that in the anti-racism plan, the Commission made clear that it is already to look into new legislation to close gaps in the protection against discrimination, and that it sees action by the state, including police, as such a gap. This is of particular importance from our national viewpoint because actions by the state are not covered by the German Equal Treatment Act. But it is an important issue as we see in the cases of racial profiling. And it is equally important that the Commission puts such an emphasis on strong and effective equality bodies as tools to fully implement existing legislation, to ensure that people can actually experience and trust the European Union's protection against discrimination as a meaningful factor in their lives. Making sure that every national equality body has the power of litigation, strategic litigation would go a long way towards achieving this goal. Again, from our national viewpoint, such litigation powers would considerably strengthen us and it would benefit victims of discrimination. So it then falls to member states. If the European Union sees itself as a union of values and rights, its members have to be serious about the implementation of its fundamental values, of which equality is an essential one. They have to be serious about the fundamental right to non-discrimination enshrined in the Fundamental Rights Charter. In this context, I personally wonder if the Commission and the Parliament shouldn't make even more use of Article 21 of the Charter. The Charter underpins the protection of the equality directives, but it goes beyond them and it deepens them. In my view, it offers ample grounds for further legislation that could clarify how the directives and the Charter relate to each other. So I'm hopeful that we are not at the dead end for European equality legislation, quite to the contrary. The European Union can be stronger, fairer, and more equal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Franke, for your really inspiring thoughts, I think, on how we can move forward. I would like to give the floor now to MEP Malin Björk again.
Thank you. I think that I managed to overstep my time maybe a little bit and say the things I had in this part. I do think that again, like equality enabling policies are of legislative nature, but they're also of course other nature. And this hence the issue of rule of law and democracy and fundamental rights, and the issue of sanctions in relation to that. And I'm very skeptical to the Commission report on this, not because of its contents, but because of its potential. It's just a discussion document. We will have another discussion club in the council. No, there is nothing linked to it. It's a preventative mechanism. Well, if it's a preventative mechanism, why didn't it also include then civil society and the more broader range of fundamental rights issues? If it's anyway, you know, so in that sense, I'm not overly impressed by that. I think also I want to. It has been raised here. We have a set of other legislative areas. Be it in the area of migrants and refugees, which I work a lot with, where I see very, very, very big issues of discrimination against be it LGBTI asylum seekers or even gender-based discrimination. And that's an area where we also need to take more action, where we have, legislation, because we have EU legislation that prohibits that kind of discrimination, but it's still happening. It's very overt. So I think here we can act together. It's very, maybe this is for, I'll save the rest for our concluding remarks, looking into some other policy areas where I think equality dimension is actually a legal obligation and should be also. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Malin, for your concluding remarks from your side. I would now like to give the floor to Sophie Latraverse.
Thank you, Tamás. I would say I was very interested in putting together all of your comments with respect to the importance of convincing on the relevance of equality law. I think it goes to enforcement, it goes to the success of this legislative attempt, it goes to enforcement, it goes to convincing operators to invest in equality. And we have to remember, and I'm reminded that every day by non-discrimination specialist colleagues, that when we talk about some words like systemic, transversal, multiple discrimination, people don't really understand what we talk about, and they don't see it for what it is. And making the reality, this has been said, behind discrimination law, behind discrimination, visible, understandable, I think is a huge challenge in order to be able to go further with any equality agenda at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. I would like to ask now Ms. Maxova for her concluding remarks.
Thank you for the floor. I think that there is remarkable progress in many of the EU member states, yet it is obviously that more positive developments are needed. The European Parliament wants an inclusive society in which all the citizens are truly equal. It is therefore crucial to ensure that there is no discrimination and that the rights of persons with disabilities are effectively protected and promoted. As I already said, I am convinced that the establishment of disability focal points in all EU institutions would be a significant step forward in creating an effective legislative framework that protects and promotes the rights of persons with disabilities and therefore moves us closer to achieving inclusive society. Apart from that, I firmly believe that we need robust and disaggregated data to take into account the intersection of issues and experiences of persons with disabilities, such as those due to gender, age, refugees, asylum, migrant status, or ethnic minority backgrounds, as well as different types of disability. We should also collect data on the number of persons with disabilities living in institutions and of children with disabilities living outside of household. This will allow for informed policy making and it will help to eradicate the disparities. I would like to emphasize how pleased that I am to be at today's conference, which underlines the importance on equality legislation, and I am convinced that we will work all together and be stronger. Thank you very much.
Thank you, MEP Maxova, and we would like to underline how pleased we are that you are with us, of course. Next, I would like to pass on the floor to Mr. Patrick Charlier.
You're right. So I think that we have to be strong together. Sometimes we have the impression that equality and human rights are less popular and supported than some years ago. We see at the international level and national level that there are strong negative winds putting the principle of equality and non-discrimination in question. So an afternoon such as we are participating today is very important to get the to have some hope. And at the same time, we see movements such as Black Lives Matter or Me Too, who are very vocal, and it's also for me a sign of hope. We have to think and to act, I think, for all citizens, and explaining that everybody can gain for equality and non-discrimination. And all the ideas that have been here presented, I think that they have to be transformed in action for every of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Next, I would like to ask Martin for his closing thoughts.
Thank you, Tamás. I think it's very interesting to listen to. It's very also interesting that I'm put after Patrick, because we are sometimes the dove and the hawk kind of thing. And I do firmly believe in the hawk thing, because I do think that there's a symbolic aspect to coming back to the issue of sanctions. Not only in terms of actual effectiveness, it also does show that this is rights that matter to society. As long as we are reducing it to something fluffy and soft and something that we should just understand that equality is important, we won't get very far. But if we do put money behind the words, we actually communicate to the actors that this is important. And just as you mentioned, Tamás, the GDPR aspect, no one really cares about personal data before the GDPR. And it's not because they have been convinced about the greatness of the right of personal data that people are scrambling to make sure they comply. I think it's the same with discrimination. There's unfortunately, I wish I would say differently, but after almost 10 years working in the field, I'll say that the interest of compliance is extremely low. And the litigation model without, US-style punitive damages, which is, I agree with Sophie Latraverse that would do something, but it's unlikely that we would be successful pushing that through in Europe, I think. But without that, litigation will not serve the purpose of ensuring enforcement. It does serve a very important purpose of attaining strategic aims. So strategic litigation is a very useful tool, but thinking that litigation will somehow ensure effective enforcement of the equality provisions, I think is barking up the wrong tree. So again, look at the sanctions issue. Look at specifically the issue of algorithmic discrimination, which is already, I have to stress, covered by the existing framework. Is there or is there not sanctions that are tailored to it? And why should an infringement that would be, for example, profiling under the data protection regulation, why should that cost millions and millions? When an infringement of fundamental discrimination provisions would cost nothing. It's really, if we're going to take these rights seriously, and this is right of equality is on Article 2 of the treaty. I mean, it's a fundamental right, but we do not treat it as such. We treat it as a symbolic right, and something that we actually, if we look at the legislations in the member states, we actually have not really, we don't really want it to be applied. If you look at how the legislation is implemented. And I think that's a matter for the Commission to look into.
Thank you very much, Martin, for your hawkish thoughts. Now, as the last, but absolutely not least, we were saving this place for Alice as co-organizer and rapporteur on the Horizontal Directive. Now, of course, we broadened our thinking, but we would like her closing thoughts very much.
Thank you, and I'm so happy that I'm part of this, part of arranging this, but I'm so also happy for you, Equinet, that you do all this for us, and that we can be able to have this discussion. And I have been filled with so many thoughts and perspectives, and I have been writing all the time to my colleagues to follow that up, and we must see to this, and so on and so on. So this has been really, really good. And many of you, I've been writing down things all of you had said that I really will carry with me. But I think just to take something from the last speaker, Martin, from Sweden, that violating rights shall come with a cost. So follow the money. I think this is very important. And again, isn't it, I mean, it's so important that we don't, and I know that you don't, but that we are, many of us mustn't accept what is going on. So this mental shift that Martin also was talking about, even he has his 3 stages of mental shift. It's a mental shift also on in a broader picture. We really need to see that if we don't fight for rights now, the right not to be discriminated, when shall we fight for it then? I mean, it has never been more important. We must fight for these rights now because they are on the way to be undermined. And there are so strong forces really wanting us to see this right as something fluffy, something extra, something that will come afterwards, because right now we have so many other more important things to handle. So I was on fire before, but I'm even more on fire now. So I want to lock the doors here to the parliament and just go and grab Malin and all the others to make sure that we sit down now and take this to the next level. And I know, as Mr. Franke said, that the German presidency has been quite, I mean, they haven't given us any joy when it comes to putting things forward. And maybe it won't be during these coming years, but we can't give up. We must do more. And then I come back to what I said in the beginning with the communication. Because as Martin also said, people in our member countries don't like when rights are being violated. People understand that the rule of law, in general, people understand that the rule of law is important and that we need to fight for this. So I think that we can also organize people. We can get information and make sure that we are gathering a lot of people behind the wheel to do a change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. And of course, it is my difficult task now to try to give you a very short summary of all these thoughts. And I just hope, Alice, that your colleagues are not going to dislike us too much for all the follow-up work that they are now forced to do. But I think that it's really great to hear that the event was inspiring to you and hopefully to many others as well. Now, by way of summary, I would like to just share with you six takeaways or 6 thoughts that I'm taking away, 6 points. My first point would be hope. I think that this message of hope was mentioned specifically by Patrick in his closing remarks, but also it came across in some other interventions as well. I think we saw the continuing support to equality of the European Commission through Silvan's interventions. And of course, now we have a Commissioner for Equality. So we have to take this opportunity and capitalize on that. I think it's also important to remember, of course, that we are in a crisis and we need to respond to that crisis. But I think keeping that hope is very important. So that would be my first point. My second point would be the importance of communication. Communication and different aspects of it, which I subsume under communication, were mentioned so many times in the course of this roundtable. First of all, it was mentioned that equality isn't and shouldn't be seen as a luxury. And this point was driven home very powerfully during the crisis, where I think that many governments were trying to take shortcuts, saying that now public health response is more important than looking at the rights of persons with disabilities or older persons, for example. And as MEP Walsh said it, this is disappointing or even disgusting to look at it in this way. I think that communication is also important in terms of how we communicate and how we drive home the points that equality is also a rule of law matter, for example, which is intrinsically linked, and you cannot really have a functioning democracy where you are having directly and maybe even on purpose inequality and discriminatory provisions. I think it's also important to communicate and to see and use that people require, request, and deserve better protection as well. And we have to use that in our communication. And as Alice said it in one of her remarks, it's also important to underline that if we are to be one union of one European Union of different countries, but that are based on the same principles, it's very important that we should have one standard for such, when it comes to such basic principles and such basic rights as the right to equal treatment on all grounds, and the right to equal opportunities, but also to aim for substantive equality, because we can do better than what we are doing at the moment. My third point is relates to how we get there, and we heard that we have to be strategic about that. We heard how we have to keep on exchanging good practices, how we have to coordinate, how we have to build alliances, and how we, of course, also need to have a plan B and a plan C if the plan A doesn't work out. I think it's all very important, and the point is very powerfully made with the Horizontal Directive that sometimes it is just proving difficult, but we shouldn't despair. We should keep on fighting for it and fight for the values that we hold dear as a union and as member states. My fourth point would be intersectionality. Intersectionality we could talk about for a very, very long time. And of course, this is one of those concepts that Sophie Latravers mentioned. Maybe most people in our European Union don't even understand. And if you say intersectionality, you have to explain that, and we have to get better at explaining it. But I think that at its heart is the important objective to make sure that we protect the most vulnerable among the vulnerable people and in the vulnerable groups or those at risk of discrimination. So having an intersectional approach and looking at what groups are most discriminated, what groups are facing specific challenges and even systemic challenges is going to be very important if we are to succeed. My fifth point would be enforcement. We have talked about great new ideas in terms of public procurement, in terms of institutional architecture, and in terms of many other things. But I think it was also made very clearly by some of our panelists that if we are not even able to enforce successfully and effectively the existing legislation, and that seems to be the case, unfortunately, then we have very little chance and opportunity to think about the next steps. So when it comes to effective enforcement, it is important to collect data. That point was made by MEP Maxova as well, for example. It is important to shift away from the reparative equality and reparation as the main mechanism that we are using to implement equality and look at how we can prevent discrimination from happening in the first place, and of course be proactive in promoting equality. And for that, we need strong sanctions as well. And I think it is going to be very important to see how all this thinking that was raised in terms of sanctions can be connected with another issue that was raised by a couple of panelists when it comes to artificial intelligence. There seems to be a big almost hype about artificial intelligence. And some people question whether the already existing legislation, equality legislation, is able to respond to challenges of equality by way of artificial intelligence. And that is, I think, a valid discussion that we should have. But I'm wondering if this big focus now on artificial intelligence which seems to be very fashionable in a way, could be used to show that with artificial intelligence, so much harm can be done to persons and to equality, that maybe it might help us to get people think about higher sanctions for the violation of the right to equal treatment. And my last point, maybe it's not going to come as a surprise, is the importance of public enforcement, and in that, the importance of strengthening equality bodies. I think it is extremely important to have a strong and well-functioning, independent and effective mechanism in each and every member state that can help to promote equality and can help directly the victims of discrimination to claim their rights and have them render their rights. And in that, I think the standards that we already have, as it was mentioned by Mr. Charlier, for example, but also Sandra Konstatsky, it's very important that what we already have is already useful, but it's not a legally binding document. Neither the European Commission recommendation nor the ECRI GPR is legally binding. So imagine if this is already very helpful in some country contexts, how much more helpful could that be if we had some legally binding legislation on equality bodies? And I think that now, again, to close this circle, we come back to the opportunity, because with the action plan on racism or against racism of the European Commission, now we have an opportunity which we should really seize. This would be my summary. I'm sure I have missed many, many things, but as my prerogative as a moderator, this is my very arbitrary summary of the event. And with that, I would like to hand over to our Equinet chair, Ms. Tena Simonovic Einwalter, who spoke at the opening and now had all the time to reflect and listen to all these interesting interventions, and now she will close the event. So I will say goodbye now and hand over to Tena.
Thank you so much, Tamás. Now, of course, it's easier to close events like this when you write or have somebody else write a speech for you in advance, assuming what will be said, and then you just read it out. But yes, that would be way too easy. And unsurprisingly also, Tamás, I've been taking notes much like you, and some of my conclusions will be very similar to yours, but that's because not all has been pre-written, and I think it's always better that way. So yes, it's time to say goodbye, and it's my role to do it, and it saddens me to say goodbye to everyone here, but I think we should look at this roundtable as just one more step in our efforts as Equinet, but also all our efforts to make Equinet, to make equality a reality. Of course, I want to start these closing remarks by thanking everyone who has made this roundtable possible, from our very valuable secretariat to our esteemed panelists, to our fellow civil society organization colleagues who responded to our request to emphasize in statements available on our website why we need a strong legislative framework, and to everyone who watched, whether they registered or they watched our live stream on Facebook. And of course, I want to especially thank our co-organizer, MEP Alice Bah Kuhnke, and her great team for helping make this a reality. And I could not think of a better ally for this roundtable than the current rapporteur on the Horizontal Directive. So thank you again, Alice. Now, from what we have heard today, there is an overall consensus, at least amongst us present here, that the current EU equality legislation has been useful in strengthening equality, but we need to go further. We need strong and comprehensive equality legislation, which is well implemented and enforced. Now, as I'm here representing Equinet and my fellow equality bodies, I want to once again stress the role equality bodies have in all this. As strong and independent equality bodies are needed to fulfill the potential equality bodies hold, to make the legislative provisions promise a reality in the national context. I have to say the situation is very different across Europe. Equality bodies are very different when it comes to our sizes, mandates, function, powers, but also levels of independence when you look at independence as a de jure, de facto independence, which needs to come together in reality. And in some countries, in some cases, the independence has been or is being threatened. And this is why and how we started advocating a long time ago for standards for equality bodies. And we got them. As we heard many times today, the European Commission published in 2008 the recommendation for standards for equality bodies. Also, ECRI, Council of Europe's ECRI adopted standards for equality bodies in its revised General Policy Recommendation number 2 on equality bodies, a work I'm proud to have been a part of, having chaired the working group which drafted its ECRI GPR, directed to authorities in all Council of Europe member states, so also directed to all authorities in all EU member states. But, as Tamás just mentioned, neither of these is legally binding, and both need to be fully implemented. We need to see governments implement these standards to ensure equality bodies are strong, independent, and effective, so that we can fulfill the potential I already mentioned, including for both using strategic litigation, which was mentioned, as a way to move things forward to fight in courts, but also to work on preventing discrimination before it happens, as was also mentioned. Now, these standards should include provisions on mandate powers, independence, resources, accessibility, and place in the overall equality infrastructure. But one thing that is really striking is that we only become aware why they are so important when things go wrong in the national context. And you can also, and we should also connect it to rule of law issues. We need to have safeguards before equality bodies are threatened or made weak in the national context. Not for equality bodies as such, not for us working in equality bodies to retain our jobs and positions, but because this has an important impact on equality and on people being discriminated against in our countries. As Equinet, we especially welcome the new Commission initiative announced recently to consider adopting legally binding legislation for equality bodies. This initiative would really be key in providing us with the guarantees we need to do our job properly. And also, it's important to note the Commission also supported and strongly recommended member states to enable litigation powers to equality bodies. Now, today we have gathered ideas about how to advance the negotiation process and objectives on the Horizontal Directive, presented in 2008, now 12 years later, not adopted. As we have heard today, the road has been long, it has been bumpy, but much like Tamás, I would say there is space for hope. And I do want to highlight the hope, because when speaking about the Horizontal Directive, this proposal has been also abandoned by many over time. And hope was highlighted in the exchange we heard in front of us today when Silvan spoke regarding the Horizontal Directive. He spoke of the European Commission's intentions, and he said the Commission does not intend to break the Horizontal Directive up in parts, distinguishing between the grounds. The Commission does not intend to retract it, and the Commission does not intend to make it weaker. And then Alice, as rapporteur for the Horizontal Directive in the European Parliament, commented this gives rise to hope. And that's something that I really want to take away from this event, not abandoning the proposal and pushing for strong European legislation regarding age, disability, sexual orientation, and religion is key. But exact ways of how to progress forward have yet to be found. As we all know, it's all about getting to those who are not speaking here today in order for us to progress. Some of the ideas we heard today were governments putting pressure on each other, MPs also, and importantly, communicating the right way. Again, the communication, which has been stressed throughout the event, in order to create a greater awareness and understanding, which could potentially even lead to enough public pressure on the need for this legislation at the European level. But even in the absence of European legislation, we have much work to do at the national level. We can advocate for and help bring about comprehensive national legislation, even when there is no legal obligation to do so, coming from the European level. Having worked on our National Anti-Discrimination Act in 2008, I can tell you there are countries where there are, like in my country, 17 grounds of prohibited grounds where discrimination is prohibited on an unlimited number of fields. However, here we come to another issue, and that is enforcement. So having great legislation is great, but without enforcement, we don't really have much. Enforcement of legislation is key. Enforcement in courts, enforcement in cases in front of us as equality bodies, and in preventive action. Of course, the way the system is set up, as we heard today, in order to dissuade discriminators from discriminating at all, and here, as Tamás mentioned, let's take the GDPR and the dissuasiveness on of the sanctions in this particular case, which works wonders, as we can see all across Europe today. Now, it has been a fascinating and insightful exchange of ideas, and for that, I thank you all, especially the panelists. We, and by we, I mean both Equinet and equality bodies, as always, stand ready to cooperate with legal and policy makers, as well as our colleagues in the civil society and other allies in finding the best formula to make the promise of equality a reality. We need hope, we need action in all levels, European, national, regional, and local, and we need alliances, and we need to communicate the right way about all this. Equality matters. Equality is not a luxury, it's a necessity. And with that, I thank you all.